The air on Zerfos 9 was suffocatingly thick with desperation, the kind of despair you could almost taste. The marketplace, once a vibrant patchwork of alien cultures and human ingenuity, had devolved into a chaotic sprawl of overcrowded stalls and scavengers hunting for scraps. The terraformed sky, an artificial blend of deep violet and burnt orange, stretched overhead, casting eerie hues over the scene. For many here, hope was as scarce as the food they fought over. "Help me, please?" The cry sliced through the noise, raw and trembling with anguish. Kai Darrow froze mid-step, his boots crunching against the dry, cracked soil. The voice wasn't human, its tone was liquid, rippling with strange harmonic vibrations. He turned his head toward the source, heart tightening like a fist. That's when he saw her. She stood near the edge of the market chaos, almost invisible in the swirling dust and dim light. Her translucent skin shimmered faintly, revealing glowing veins that pulsed like trapped starlight. The woman was Rexari, one of the aquatic species displaced after the war had rendered their homeworld an arid wasteland. Her frame was frail, her shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of a collapsing universe. Her baby, no more than a bundle of faintly glowing tissue wrapped in rags, rested limply in her arms. Its light was barely flickering, the bioluminescent glow so faint it was almost indistinguishable from the twilight surrounding them. The child's breathing was shallow, rhythmic only in the way dying things are. Kai had seen suffering before. Too much of it if he was being honest. After years on the front lines of the interstellar conflict, he thought he'd grown numb to the sight of hollow faces and pleading eyes. But there was something in the way this woman cradled her child, a desperate, trembling tenderness, that reached past his defenses and struck a chord he thought long buried. "Please," she said again, her voice wavering, her alien eyes glistening with unshed tears. Her gaze darted around the marketplace, landing on Kai like a drowning swimmer spotting a lifeline. "He hasn't eaten in days. I can't," she faltered, clutching the child closer as if shielding it from an invisible predator. Kai's instincts flared. He glanced at the stalls around him. The food supplies were pitiful. Scraps of dried meat, wilting vegetables and protein synth bars selling for prices no refugee could afford. Traders barked their wares, indifferent to the suffering around them. A few mercenaries loitered nearby, their weapons visible, ready to enforce order should desperation boil over into violence. "They'll let her die before they give her anything," Kai thought bitterly. His jaw tightened as memories of similar scenes clawed their way to the surface. Starving civilians, children wasting away in the rubble of war zones, people reduced to little more than shadows of themselves. He shook the images away. This wasn't then. He wasn't a soldier anymore. But that didn't mean he could walk away. He stepped toward her, weaving through the crowded market, his hand brushing the ration pack strapped to his belt. It wasn't much, half a loaf of synthetic bread and a small pouch of nutrient gel, but it was enough to keep someone alive for another day. As he drew closer, the woman's glow dimmed further, her head lowering as though bracing for rejection. She had likely begged others before him, only to be ignored or pushed aside. Kai crouched in front of her, his movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching a wounded animal. The child's dim glow flickered again, weaker this time, and something in Kai's chest twisted. "Take this," he said softly, removing the rations from his belt and holding them out to her. Her eyes widened, the faint glow in her translucent pupils intensifying. For a moment she stared at him, uncomprehending, as though the gesture didn't register. Then, with trembling hands, she reached out and took the food. The baby stirred weakly at the scent of sustenance, letting out a faint, mewling cry that sounded like a mix of water droplets and static. The mother's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the rations, but she steadied herself, clutching them tightly to her chest. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. Kai didn't answer. He didn't have one. He just felt an overwhelming need to do something, to act, even if it was only a small kindness in a universe drowning in cruelty. When she looked back up at him, tears spilled from her alien eyes, streaking her luminescent skin like shooting stars across the night sky. Her body shuddered with sobs, the quiet kind that erupted when someone had been holding them back for far too long. Kai glanced around uneasily. A few nearby traders were watching the scene, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. He ignored them, focusing instead on the woman and her child. "Eat," he said gently. "Your baby needs you." She nodded, unable to speak, and began opening the ration pack with trembling fingers. Her movements were clumsy, and Kai had to resist the urge to help her, knowing the gesture might overwhelm her further. As the child began to feed, its glow grew brighter, steadying into a soft, warm light. The mother let out a choked sob of relief, her entire body sagging as if the weight of her despair had momentarily lifted. Kai stood slowly, unsure of what else to do. He didn't expect gratitude, he hadn't done it for that, but the look she gave him was something he would never forget. It wasn't just thanks. It was the kind of look that said he had given her more than food. He had given her hope. "May the stars bless you," she murmured, her voice trembling but sincere. Kai nodded stiffly, his throat tight. He turned away, blending back into the crowd, but the image of her glowing child burned itself into his memory. For the first time in years, Kai felt something other than guilt. He felt a flicker of purpose. And as he walked away, he couldn't help but wonder if this small act of kindness had set something larger in motion, something that might ripple out into the universe like a stone dropped into water. The baby's faint glow flickered like a dying ember in the darkness of the overcrowded refugee camp. Shireen sat huddled against the wall of an abandoned shuttle bay, her translucent skin glowing softly as she clutched her child. The faint sound of her quiet sobs was swallowed by the cacophony around her, an overwhelming mixture of alien languages, desperate shouts, and the ever-present clamor of hunger. Kai stood a short distance away watching. He hadn't intended to linger, but something about her desperation had latched onto him, refusing to let go. He wasn't sure why, but he felt like walking away now would be abandoning more than just this woman and her baby. It would be abandoning what was left of his humanity. The air was heavy with the acrid smell of burning scrap metal and unwashed bodies. Traders barked their prices from makeshift stalls, their voices competing against the hum of nearby power generators. Above it all, an intercom crackled intermittently, announcing meaningless updates in 3 different languages. It was a place where survival trumped morality, and kindness was as rare as the fresh water everyone craved. Shireen's shoulders trembled as she cradled her child, the alien infant's soft cries barely audible over the chaos. Kai had already given them his rations, but he could see the problem clearly now. One meal wasn't going to be enough. "Mommy?" a small raspy voice beside him said. Kai glanced down to see a human child, no older than 7, tugging on the sleeve of her mother. The woman was crouched over a pile of scavenged vegetables, trying to determine if any of it was edible. Without thinking, Kai looked away. He couldn't help everyone. He could barely help himself. But as he turned his gaze back to Shireen, something inside him snapped. He couldn't shake the image of her baby's dimming light or the way her tears had streaked her glowing face. She was losing hope, and once that was gone, there would be nothing left. Kai shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, trying to ground himself. His fingers brushed against the cool metal of his script tag, the identification chip that linked him to the aid network. The tag was more than just a name and number, it was a lifeline, granting him access to resources he hadn't touched in months. He hesitated. Using the script tag meant taking a risk. Supplies were already stretched thin, and if he called in a favor, it might mean less food for others in the camp. But the alternative was watching a mother and her child fade away in front of him. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, pulling the tag out. The device lit up in his hand, its holographic interface flickering to life. Kai tapped a series of commands, his fingers moving faster than his thoughts. He didn't have time to second-guess himself. Within seconds, the tag buzzed softly, confirming his request. A drone delivery was en route, carrying a small supply crate from the nearest humanitarian outpost. It wasn't much, but it would keep Shireen and her child alive for another week. Kai exhaled sharply, shoving the tag back into his pocket. He glanced around the marketplace, hoping no one had noticed. Aid supplies were valuable enough to steal, and he didn't want to draw attention to himself, or to Shireen. The alien widow looked up as he approached, her glowing eyes wide with confusion. I called in a delivery, Kai said, his voice low but firm. It'll be here soon. Her translucent face twisted with emotion, gratitude, relief, and something else he couldn't quite place. For a moment she didn't speak, her luminous veins pulsing faintly beneath her skin. Then her gaze dropped to her child and she nodded. Why? She asked softly, echoing her earlier question. Kai hesitated, his jaw tightening. He didn't have a good answer, not one that made sense even to himself. Because I can, he said finally, his voice barely audible over the noise of the market. And because someone has to. Before she could respond, the low hum of an approaching drone cut through the air. Heads turned as the sleek machine descended, its metallic body gleaming under the artificial light. It hovered briefly before lowering a small crate to the ground with a soft thud. Kai moved quickly, retrieving the crate before anyone else could. He carried it back to Shireen, setting it down in front of her. Open it, he said, stepping back to give her space. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, revealing an assortment of ration packs, water purification tablets, and a small medical kit. The sight of the supplies seemed to overwhelm her, and she covered her mouth with one hand, her eyes brimming with tears again. The baby let out a faint, gurgling sound, almost a laugh, and reached weakly for one of the ration packs. Shireen let out a choked sob, her glowing body trembling as she clutched her child tightly. Kai felt a pang of emotion he couldn't quite name. Relief maybe. Or something deeper. But the moment was short-lived. A shadow fell over them, and Kai looked up to see a group of mercenaries approaching. They were armed, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders, but their expressions were anything but casual. That's a lot of supplies for one family, one of them said, his voice cold and calculating. Kai stepped between them and Shireen, his posture tense. They're not yours, he said firmly, his voice carrying an edge of warning. The mercenary smirked, his gaze flicking between Kai and the crate. This is a refugee zone, he said. Nothing belongs to anyone for long. Shireen clutched her child, her glow dimming as fear took hold. Kai felt his fists clench. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but the instincts were still there, the need to protect, to fight if necessary. You don't want to do this, Kai said, his voice low and steady. The mercenary's smirk faltered, and for a moment there was silence. Then, with a grunt, he motioned for his men to back off. Kai didn't relax until they disappeared into the crowd. He turned back to Shireen, his expression softening. Stay here, he said. I'll keep watch. She nodded, her glowing eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. As the marketplace buzzed around them, Kai realized he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He had made a choice to get involved, to fight for something, or someone, when it would have been easier to walk away. And in doing so he had made himself a target. The tension in the air thickened as Kai kept watch, his senses on high alert. The situation was far from over, and he knew it. But for now the baby's light had grown stronger, and for the first time in days Shireen looked like she had hope. Kai just hoped it would be enough.
The sound of raised voices shattered the brief moment of calm, piercing through the chaotic symphony of the refugee camp. Kai spun around, his heart thumping like a drum as he caught sight of the same group of mercenaries from earlier, now flanked by more men. Their leader's smirk had been replaced by a cold, menacing glare. I told you nothing stays private here, the man growled, his words sharp enough to cut through the noise. The tension was palpable. People in the marketplace began to scatter, not wanting to get caught in the middle of whatever was about to unfold. Kai's mind raced as he positioned himself protectively in front of Shireen and her child. The infant let out a soft whimper, its dim light flickering like a candle in the wind. Back off, Kai said, his voice steady, but laced with warning. This doesn't have to go any further. The mercenary barked out a laugh, the kind that made Kai's stomach churn. Oh, it's gone further already, he sneered. You think you can hoard supplies in a place like this and not pay the price? Kai clenched his fists, his instincts screaming at him to do something, but he knew the odds weren't in his favor. These weren't just desperate scavengers. They were professionals, armed to the teeth and ready to take what they wanted. Shireen's trembling voice broke through his thoughts. Please, she whispered, her glowing eyes pleading. Don't let them take my baby's hope. Those words hit Kai like a punch to the gut. He glanced at the crate of supplies, then back at the mercenaries. They didn't see a starving mother or a dying child. They only saw profit. You want the supplies? Kai said, his voice rising.
Fine. Take them.
But you leave them out of this. The leader tilted his head, feigning consideration. Generous of you, he said with a sly grin. But I think I'll take it all. Supplies, the woman, and that glowing little freak of hers. There's always a market for rare curiosities. Kai's blood ran cold. His vision tunneled as the words sank in. They weren't just here to steal, they were here to destroy. No, he said firmly, stepping forward. That's not happening. The mercenary leader raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. And what are you going to do about it, hero? Kai didn't answer. Instead, he shifted his weight, preparing for what he knew would be a losing fight. He wasn't armed, and even if he had been, he was outnumbered. But he couldn't stand by and let them take Shireen and her child. The first punch came fast, a blur of motion that caught Kai off guard. Pain exploded across his jaw as he staggered back, barely keeping his balance. The mercenaries closed in, their laughter echoing in his ears. But Kai didn't back down. He lunged forward, driving his shoulder into one of them and sending the man sprawling. It wasn't enough to turn the tide, but it bought him a few precious seconds. Shireen screamed as one of the mercenaries grabbed her arm, dragging her away from the crate. The baby's cries grew louder, its light flickering erratically as if responding to the chaos around it. Let her go, Kai shouted, his voice raw with desperation. He swung wildly at another mercenary, landing a solid hit that sent the man reeling. But it wasn't enough. There were too many of them, and they were too well prepared. Kai hit the ground hard, his breath knocked out of him as a boot connected with his ribs. Pain radiated through his body, but he forced himself to look up. The mercenary leader was standing over him, his expression smug. You should have stayed out of it, he said, raising his weapon. Kai. Shireen's voice rang out, filled with terror. Kai braced himself, expecting the worst. But before the leader could pull the trigger, a deafening roar erupted from the crowd. A group of refugees surged forward, armed with whatever they could find, pipes, scrap metal, even broken bottles. They moved as one, a wave of desperation and fury aimed directly at the mercenaries. The sudden uprising caught the mercenaries off guard. They hesitated, their confidence faltering as the crowd closed in. Kai seized the moment, pushing himself to his feet despite the pain. He grabbed a piece of debris from the ground and swung it at the nearest mercenary, knocking the weapon out of his hands. Get the supplies, he shouted to Shireen. Go. She didn't need to be told twice. Clutching her baby tightly, she scrambled to her feet and grabbed the crate. Her glowing form moved through the chaos like a beacon, drawing the attention of several refugees who quickly formed a protective barrier around her. The mercenaries were retreating now, overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of the crowd. The leader shouted orders, but it was clear he had lost control. Kai didn't stop fighting until the last of them disappeared into the shadows. He stood there, panting and bruised, as the crowd began to disperse. The makeshift weapons clattered to the ground, and the refugees returned to their scavenging as if nothing had happened. Shireen approached him cautiously, her glowing eyes filled with gratitude and guilt. You risked everything for us, she said, her voice trembling. Kai shrugged, wincing at the pain in his ribs. Someone had to, he said simply. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Thank you, she whispered. You saved us. Kai nodded, his gaze drifting to the baby in her arms. The infant's light was brighter now, its soft glow filling the dark corners of the marketplace. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kai allowed himself a small, weary smile. But as he looked around at the battered refugees and the remnants of the conflict, he knew the fight wasn't over. The mercenaries would be back, and next time, they wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating the camp's resilience. Kai clenched his fists, the faint spark of determination igniting within him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about hope.